we're 50-50 partners. He just steps up and steps in when I'm out, and I step up and step in when he's out. What a perfect partnership that we have developed over the years. They're out there, and you find the good ones and you just stick with them. You can make a lot of money. You get a lot of good things.
You're a working professional, but struggling to balance the workload of your career, family, obligations, and preparing for your financial future? If so, this podcast is for you. You've spent years learning your craft, and now it's time to focus on your financial future. This podcast will teach you what you need to retire wealthy and happy. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Retire Wealthy and Happy podcast. We created this podcast to provide financial tips and tricks to help you build up your passive income, and also provide methods that you can use to protect your wealth so that you can plan a better future for yourself and your family. We're grateful to have this podcast sponsored by Monument Real Estate Capital. Monument Real Estate Capital, helping you retire 10 years early through real estate investments. Are you thinking about buying your own investment property, but are unsure of how difficult it will be to manage? In today's episode, we get to learn from Glenn Gonzales, who has managed thousands of apartment units throughout his career. Let's jump in so you can see if managing investment property is right for you. On today's episode, we're excited to have Glenn Gonzales with us. A brief background about Glenn: he is the owner of Obsidian Capital Company. He is the principal of Napa Ventures, president and broker at CGC Investments. And Glenn has over 25 years experience in the multifamily real estate industry. He's overseen the operation of over 7,000 units across 38 properties in 5 states. He's currently based in Austin, Texas. A brief overview of what we'll cover on today's episode. We're going to talk about getting started in real estate investing. We're going to talk about what it's like managing an investment property. And we're also going to talk about who Obsidian Capital is and what they do.
Glenn, thanks for being on the show today. Would you be willing to share a little bit about your background? I'm curious about how it talks about you starting out as a maintenance person or cleaning, portering, something like that, and how you ended up managing thousands of apartment units.
I sure will. Thanks. Well, Ben and Earl, thanks for having me on your show. I'm pretty excited. So it's always kind of fun, relive the past and talk about how I got from A to B. A lot of people say to me when I meet them, how did you get started in real estate? Earl, to answer your question, I started off as a maintenance man. I was going to college up at the University of Utah, and my wife at the time was a leasing consultant at the apartments that we had just moved into as newlyweds, and they got behind on work orders. So you want to help do some work orders and get caught up? And I'm like, sure. But in that process of doing that, I'm shoveling walks in the snow and picking up dog crap and fixing toilets and dishwashers and stoves. And meanwhile, the people that were leasing the apartments are in the office talking on the phone. And I'm like, man, I wish I had their job, not this job. And so the regional manager came to visit the property, and I stopped her and asked, hey, is there any chance I could kind of work in the office and maybe be a manager someday? And they're like, aren't you the maintenance man? I'm like, yeah, I am. They're like, well, maybe you should go back and keep doing maintenance. And I'm like, oh, that's not cool. But anyway, long story short, they eventually called and said, hey, we have this little 60-unit apartment community. Would you like to be kind of the part-time manager and the part-time maintenance? Because we can't really afford full-time for each one of those. And I'm like, absolutely. So I did. And that was my introduction into property management and out of maintenance. But that's what transitioned me. But that's where it all started. And over my career, I was then a property manager, a regional manager, and grew with a small fee management company to be their director of operations, and kind of outgrew that company and actually got fired. Funny story. I was the director of operations, and I had a mentor. His name was Tahl. He helped me get my CPM designation and helped grow my career as I was growing in property management. I graduated from the University of Utah. I was supposed to be a hospital administrator, and I did an internship, and I did not want to be a hospital administrator the rest of my life. So I went to my boss, Tahl. I'm like, hey, I'm going to make property management my career. And he's like, that's great. You know, you need to do this, this, and this, get your CPM, get your real estate license, and perfect your craft. I'm like, okay. So I did that. And I was with him for 5 or 6 years. And then he fired me. And I'm like, I'm your right-hand man. Why are you firing me? He's like, you know what? Because you keep saying you want to buy the company, you want to be the boss, you know, we're a small company and you've gone as far as you can go. And he's like, until you take my job, but I'm not going anywhere. I own it. And I said, so you're firing me? He goes, you need to go soar with the eagles. I'm like, so you're firing me? He's like, you will land on your feet. You will get a better job. You will get with a better company. You've got so much more to give. And I'm like, but you're firing me? I mean, really? But he was right, because I was in a comfort zone, you guys, and I probably never would have left that company. It was my whole world. And I left that company and went to another property management company that was probably twice the size. And I became their director of operations and also learned all the tax credit stuff. So they were doing development, they were doing property management and tax credit management. So I just added that to my little toolbox of things that I learned along the way.
Was that Sovereign Emerson that you went to work for?
It was in the same location. It was
Horizon.
Nope. It was called Evergreen Management. It was with Peter Cook, PSC Development. Do you know the guys?
I do.
Yeah. So I was with Helen Kessler was my boss. She was the president, and I was her director of operations.
So, Glenn, I thought I recognized you when you came on board. You might not remember this. We have a ton in common, by the way. I managed a property while I was going to the University of Utah. My wife and I think it was a little 60 unit over in Holiday that we managed. I did a lot of the maintenance. She took care of the office. But when I graduated, I did an internship down in Southern California with IREM Management Company. 2 or 3 years later, I came back and I actually interviewed with Dale. And I'm pretty sure that it was you that was there that interviewed me to come to work for Dale long time ago.
Wait, so Dale fired me and hired you? You took my job, bro.
No, he didn't actually hire me. He was afraid to hire me. Rima, I think, was the name of the company. Dale, when I left California, I probably had 5,000 multifamily units, 2 million square feet of office and retail. And I remember Dale looking at me and he said, Klein, you have so many skills, but I am terrified to bring you back here because my portfolio is about half of that small little portfolio that you ran in California. I remember meeting you and working with you back then, and life is very small. We end up 20 years later or 25, whenever it was, talking on a podcast together. So,
holy cow. You know, Dale Longhurst is still a very dear friend of mine today. And I mentioned him in the book because he was a true mentor. He groomed me from maintenance man, and he taught me everything he knew. And he's just a good man. To this day, we're still friends. His dad, Ray Longhurst, started the company. And if you remember, the name of the company is Real Estate Management Associates. It stood for REMA, R-E-M-A.
Small world when you get into this business. And I ended up coming back from California. I ran the commercial division for James Terry.
I know James.
And that's why I asked you about Sovereign, because they became Horizon and Pinnacle. They kind of split up and had done a lot of Section 42 down in California, but I came back and ran the commercial division. Remember the Walker Bank building downtown? If you grew up here in Salt Lake City, you have to remember the big tower that changed colors when to tell you what the weather was going to be. That was how we knew what the weather was when I was a kid.
Small world, Earl. That's funny.
I know I've met this person in the business world before, so it's really, really fun to have you here.
I'm going to share one more story, Ben, if that's okay, and Earl.
Absolutely.
Talking about these stories, I was at a conference and we were going around this big circle introducing ourselves, and some guy across the room said, I don't really want to introduce myself. I want to introduce that guy right over there. And he pointed at me. I looked at him like, oh no. What did I do? Who is this guy? I didn't recognize him. And he's like, I'd like to tell you a story about that guy. He's like, I was buying an apartment community, and 2 days before closing, the chiller broke. And he's like, he pointed at me, he goes, that man bought me a new chiller for my property, where most people would have put a Band-Aid on it and just sold him a broken chiller because it was 2 days before closing. His earnest money was already non-refundable. He already had his equity and his loan lined up. And we could have stuck to him, but I don't do that to people, and I don't want people to do that to me. So here I am sitting in a room a year later after that transaction, and he brought that up and vouched for me as a person that tries to do the right thing. So, you know, if you have listeners out there and they're doing the wrong thing and they're going to try and pass something off to a buyer, don't do that.
This is a good point that the real estate world is a small world. We got the two of you on here. So if you do something to, for lack of a better word, screw anybody over, it will most likely come back to haunt you.
Yes. Or they'll talk about it on a podcast and you don't even have to be on the podcast, you know?
Good to catch up with you again. You wrote a book called Maintenance Man to Millionaire. You want to tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah. So I really am not author in any way. A lot of people that met me just kind of asked me the question, how in the world did you get from being a maintenance man to owning 6,000 apartments? That just doesn't happen to people. And I'm like, yeah, it's a long story and it's kind of a journey. And there were lots of ups and downs. So a couple of people encouraged me to write my journey kind of as a journal type thing. And a couple of guys says, you got to write a book. And I'm sitting at a conference and somebody actually put together like a little PDF of a maintenance man to millionaire and emailed it to me while I was sitting at the conference. And he's like, here's the cover of your book. I looked and I laughed. And then I went and talked to my wife about it. And she's like, yeah, maybe that's something you should look at doing. And so I did. We went through all of the experiences I had, both good, bad, and ugly, and the lessons that I learned and the most valuable lessons that I learned. I stuck them all in the book. And that's where it came from. And my wife was a little embarrassed because she's like, why are you going to name it Maintenance Man to Millionaire? It sounds like you're bragging. Well, not bragging, but it does kind of have a catchy title to it. So that's how it came to be. And it's just 12 chapters. And it just talks about kind of the life lessons. And at the end of each chapter, there's like a little Glennism, a little nugget that you could take away. And, the first chapter really talks about you, like the individual, the value of you and what you can do for yourself. Because some people think, oh, I got to be educated. I got to have a master's degree or a doctorate degree or something to be someone or something. And that's really not the case. Just be you, but just be the best you can be and be good at what you do. If you are going to be a maintenance man, be the best maintenance man. If you're going to be a podcaster like Ben, do your research and interview people. And Earl, just be a good guy and help people and stay in the industry and teach people along the way. Just be you, really. And there's little nuggets in the book. But it also talks about some of my failures as well. So anyway, so you guys can tell your listeners to go. It's on Amazon if anybody wants to get it. I do not have it on Audible. I'm sorry. I really need one of your listeners to say, hey, I'll read your book for you and record it, because that's not me either.
We'll have links in our show notes for that book as well.
Okay, thanks.
And it's interesting that your wife's asking you why you do that. Well, the truth is the life cycle of wealth, I believe, is that we start with this passion, this desire, right, to do something. We work hard and we start to achieve that. But as we get older, there was a time I enrolled to go back and get my master's degree. And at the time, I didn't need a master's degree. In fact, I had progressed to the point in my real estate career that it was even going to help me. But my goal at the time was, when I get to this point in my life, I wanted to be able to go back and teach people how I had done that. And my thought process was you go teach at a university, and without a master's degree, they won't let me on campus, right? And so I never did. I get plenty of opportunities to teach through coaching and mentoring and other things like that. But the reason you wrote the book, I'm quite sure, is for that reason at all. You're looking for ways to give back and talk a little bit about exactly what it is that you've learned along the way. And it makes perfect sense to me. So really quick, one last thing. What inspired you to want to do more with real estate than just start where you started as a maintenance person?
Yeah, I was employed as a regional manager at Equity Residential. I was donating my time to the apartment association. And I was sitting on the board of directors with a bunch of other individuals. And this was in Washington State. And there was a gentleman there named John Gibson. Earl, you probably know John Gibson. Earl knows everybody. But anyway, he was sitting there and I said, I'm a regional manager, but I want to own some real estate, because John and others, the owners, I kind of set on this little pedestal, like they're the owners, right? They own the apartments. I'm just the guy that manages it for them. And I said, I got this little 60-unit deal. Would you take a look at it and tell me if you think it's a good deal? Because I trust you. He's like, sure, I'll look at it. He was my second mentor, by the way. John Gibson, he's in the book too, as being a mentor. And he said, you know what, you'll probably do okay on that, Glenn. I'm like, oh, great. He's like, but I have a deal that is better. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, I'll sell you this little 44-unit deal in a place called Puyallup, Washington. I said, really? And I said, tell me about it. And he goes, well, it needs a little bit of work. I'll carry a note back. You need to come up with $150,000. I'm like, $150,000? Where am I going to get $150,000? I live paycheck to paycheck. I got 5 kids and a mortgage and a car payment. And I'm like, there's no way. So I went to my boss and a contractor that we did a lot of work with, a vendor in the industry. And I said, hey guys, I found this great deal. And we need to come up with $150,000 between the three of us. And I think that we should be partners. I showed them the numbers and they said, you're right. We can make some money on this deal. We should do it. And I'm like, great. You put up 75 and you put up 75 and that'll be our down payment. And they're like, well, I thought we were going to be street partners. And how does that math work? And this is where I learned about syndication for the very first time, but I didn't know it had a word. I said, well, gosh, guys, I found the deal and I'm the one that's going to make it happen. You put up the capital, and we'll split it evenly 3 ways. I said, but here's the deal. You get paid before I do. So if we make money, you guys get your money back. And if you don't, I don't get anything either, but I'm doing all the work. So I'm like, all right, fair enough. To them, that wasn't a lot of money. To me, it was a ton of money. We did it. We gave the down payment. He carried a note back. And honest to goodness, we worked our little magic for 1.5 years and sold it for $1.5 million more than we paid for it. And if you can just imagine the feeling that I felt living paycheck to paycheck as a regional, my very first 44 unit deal, to be able to split $1 million with my friends. They were happy. I was happy. And I'm like, I can get used to this. That's the biggest check I'd ever seen in my life. That's kind of what did it for me, to be honest with you. I still worked as a regional manager after that. I still did my paycheck to paycheck, but I had a little more money in my savings account. So then I invested it into multiple 4 or 5 different rental homes. And then in 2008, 2009, all those went away. Most of them went away on a short sale, and most of them went away on all the down payments that I had put were all gone. So we can talk probably for hours, guys, about cycles, real estate cycles, and watching the economy. But it makes me more aware today when I do my investings, because we now go through cycles still today. We're facing cycles right now. Anyway, it came back in 2014, 2013, started bouncing back. I bought a 200 unit deal, and it was kind of the same story. I'm now in Texas. I'm the president and owner of a property management company, fee management. And I came across a deal that was getting foreclosed on. The bank called me and said, hey, property manager, will you give us an estimate that'll take, so we know kind of what it'll take to fix this problem? And I told them, I did. It took me a couple of weeks, but got bids, got estimates, evaluated, told them, hey, bank, you need $1 million to fix your problems. And they said, we're foreclosing. We're not investors. We're going to fire sell it. So I said to the bank, hey, guys, if you're going to fire sell it, why don't you fire sell it to me? I'll give you $1 million and we'll fix up, and all the money will go into the property. You'll be in a better position you were before. And they're like, okay, do you have $1 million? It was the same story as the $150,000 that I needed way back in the day. I'm like, no, I don't have that. $1 million, that's a lot of money. So now I knew what syndication was. Now I'm learning, because at this point, it was a 200 unit deal in San Antonio. And I'm like, I want to buy this deal. It's a gold mine. I swear, guys, 9 times out of 10, I'd go talk to investors and they're like, is this your first syndicated deal? I'm like, yes, it is. Like, hard pass for us. It's a no. And I can't tell you how deflated I felt when 9 out of 10 people tell you no. But one would say yes. And the 9 people that said no, I asked them, I said, well, do you know anybody that might be interested? They said, yeah, these guys take like risky deals. Call them. They give me a name or number. And so that's what we did. We and my business partner at the time, we just worked the phones and raised the $1 million. And that we sold it on our 1-year anniversary for a 48 IRR. Right. So those 9 people that told me no, I called them and I said, here's what I sold it for, and here's what I bought it for, and here's the return the investors got. They're like, wow, okay, you got our attention. We're in on the next one. What do you have? After that, it seemed like the floodgates were open. Got going. So
just listening to you, I think it's funny. People underestimate the power of going through property management because of the in-depth understanding. We just wrote a business plan for one of the things we're trying to do as our company. And I use the analogy that the difference between looking at properties from a drive-by every week and see them versus having to manage from long distance. And it's the difference between being site certified in an airplane versus instrument rated, right? That you get a way different perspective. You're able to look at those things and deliver really, really incredible results to your investors because of that infinite knowledge of what goes on in the property management world. So,
Earl, you're speaking my language. I'm a private pilot. And I don't have my instrument rating, but I love to fly. And I think all the places I could fly if I just had that instrument rating. Along that same line, Earl, and Ben, I was recently visiting one of my properties up in Fort Worth, and a big hot water heater that serviced the laundry room went out. And I asked them to give me some bids and came back and they said, here it is. It's like $6,000. I'm like, $6,000. I said, let's go look at it. So we went over to the laundry room and I looked at the water heater. It's one of those really big 100-gallon plus water heaters. And I asked the manager, I said, what does it service? and they pointed at these 4 washer and dryers. I said, so you need a water heater this size to operate those 4 machines. They're like, apparently that's what the plumber said. I said, I'll tell you what, why don't you run down to Home Depot, take $500 and go buy a regular 40-gallon water heater, or even a 30-gallon. You don't need one this big. And the maintenance guy could put it in himself, because I was a maintenance guy. Put in a water heater, right? Take out the old one, put in the new one. So then it was like a $500 water heater plus the maintenance man's time. And we just did it in-house on site. But unless you have a little bit of experience, how many times does a regional manager or a property manager just give you a bid and say it's going to take $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 to repair? And those are one of the painful experiences. I learned that the hard way when we had a property in Fort Worth where the maintenance guy was going through air conditioning units, and he just didn't have the skill set to troubleshoot it. So every month I was getting this ridiculous HVAC CapEx expense on this property, eating up our cash flow. So I talked to the manager, and she's like, I don't know, they just need to be replaced. They're super old. So I asked the maintenance guy, let's go walk over and show me how you troubleshoot these things. I don't know if it's a relay switch or if it's low on Freon or a thermostat. I mean, let's go look. Tell me how you walk through it. We walked out to one, and he goes, I have no idea where to start. I'm like, so when one of these break, what do you do? He's like, I just call an HVAC company and they come out and replace it. I'm like, oh my gosh. I look back at how much money that really cost me as an owner and my investors, just because nobody asked the hard question, what do you do to troubleshoot it? Yeah, we hired a supervisor that was HVAC certified, problem solved, and he just fixed them up.
I could see Ben laughing, because when we got started as a group, we'd have our Tuesday meeting where we'd go through the properties. And I can't tell you how many times I said, this is ridiculous. I can't believe, figure it out. These guys are making $300 an hour for a plumber. Are you kidding me? And it's just that mentality that says, hey, I've done this 100 times. I've looked at the cost I know what a water heater costs. I know how long it's going to take them to do this. And it's amazing how that changes your perspective. Ben, I apologize. We got started here, and I probably even jumped over a couple of your questions that you've got going here, but I'm going to give you a second to get caught up. How's that?
Well, Glenn answered several of my questions. We didn't even have to ask him. So he's just light years ahead of us. Well, but it's good. We like these stories, Glenn. I was going to ask you about your first deal, but you told us that story, which is wonderful. One of the things I want to point out to our listeners is that your first deal, at least from the way you told the story, was executed pretty well. And I would say that one of the reasons you were able to do that was because of your years of experience in property management. You knew how to operate the project. It's not like you went from nothing to your first deal and it went well, right? Like, you had a lot of experience before that. And you also mentioned you had at least 2 mentors, probably others. That's one thing I'm trying to pull out for our listeners. Like, if you want to be an active real estate investor, you can definitely do that as long as you're willing to put the time in, either with a mentor or with a partner, so that you're able to execute properly on the business plan and you don't end up either losing money or really just causing yourself a problem. So thank you for sharing that story about your first deal. I do also want to ask, and this is kind of a broad question, but I'm asking it this way on purpose. Are there things you wish you would have done differently or better at the beginning of your career that our listeners might be able to internalize and use so that they don't make similar mistakes?
That's a great question. I think back on getting from A to B, and I'll share with you some of the successes and I'll share with you some of the failures. I think one of the things that I did well over the years was I invested my time in people and relationships. There was a guy by the name of Ed, and he was up in Washington, and he was 70 years old. And I really looked up to Ed. He was very successful in real estate, and that's all he did, and very entrepreneur. And I told Dad, I said, hey, if you ever want to retire, he's 70 years old, goes to work every day. If you ever want to retire, will you call me? I'd love to buy your company and just kind of pick up where you left off. And he's like, I will never retire. Well, we stayed in touch over the years. He turned 80. He was biking in some country in Asia and got sick. And he's like, maybe I should rethink this. He's 80 years old at this point, still very active in real estate and health. And we went biking together in New Zealand. And sure enough, he agreed to sell me not just his management company, but because I didn't need the management company, but he sold me 8 apartment complexes that he owned up in DFW. And there was about 1,500 units, maybe plus or minus a little bit. And we closed all 8 of those over 6 months. So he was a friendly seller. We came to a sales price. He gave us the time to close this one and then close the next one and then close the next one. But that was a relationship that took a decade or longer to develop. And I didn't want anything in return. I just wanted to be the guy's friend, and it paid off. Now, that was a success that started early in my career. I continue to live by that same philosophy today. One of my failures is sometimes I jump into partnerships with people too soon with really not knowing their true strengths or their true character. And sometimes you get into a partnership and you're in it and it's like a marriage and you realize, this isn't working out. I feel like I'm doing more than my fair share, but you shouldn't say things like that because that's not really an honest statement. And, and then over the years, you start learning character traits that may be different, call it right or wrong, that are different than my character traits or the things that are important to me. So I think early in my career, Ben, I think I jumped into partnerships with really not fully understanding who I'm partnering with, because things will be great. You guys will be friends. When things are difficult and you got to roll up your sleeves, it gets difficult. And just like any other relationship, sometimes that strains the relationship. And depending on how you act or they act or react, it could be good or bad. Fortunately, I've exited partnerships okay. But I've learned a lot through the years on maybe vetting out my partners that I'm going to get in bed with, per se, because you're in it to win it. And it's tough to get out.
So what I'm hearing you say is, for anybody who's getting started or trying to scale up, if you're going to look for partnerships or joint ventures, whatever you want to call them, make sure that you're vetting or really digging into the person you're looking at doing business with, because it's like a marriage. It's very involved. And if there's something about that person that you won't mesh well with, it could end badly.
Yeah. I mean, I actually got in an argument. I started this podcast with you guys sharing a story about when I was at that conference and I ended up buying a chiller for this buyer. We were the seller. But my business partner at the time, he did not want to buy the chiller. We got in an argument over it. And I told him at the end of the day, if I have to, I'll take it out of my cut. But he's like, we're not obligated. He's closing in 2 days, whether or not we buy him a chiller or not. And that just didn't set well with me. And that really demonstrated the strength, I think, of his character, my character, and what we stand for. But he was technically right. We were not obligated, but I felt morally I was obligated. You can't really put moral in a contract. I think that's something that your mom and dad taught you when you were young, or you've developed over the years, or it's important to you. I don't know. So that was a lesson. And I think it's chapter 8 in my book. I talk about partnership patterns because there's also roles, and there are times. It was that same character guy that said, I think, Glenn, we should go buy some apartment complexes and buy a bunch of them. And he was very motivational. And what he brought to the partnership was a lot of initiative. And he also he didn't put any limits. I remember having a conversation with him about buying a 650 unit apartment complex. And I'm like, dude, that's a big deal. I don't know that we can do that. I'm like, we got to go get a loan from Fannie Mae for $30,000. I don't even know if we have the liquidity, and he's like, well, we'll just ask one of the investors to put up their balance sheet with us. I'm like, who's going to do that? He goes, just ask. But he was right. He was absolutely right. We bought that sucker. So, when I talk about partnership patterns, you just need to go into it with your eyes open, the good and the bad. There are good and bad in every partnership. I could talk for hours about that too.
And I appreciate you telling those details. In respect of your time, let's switch gears a little bit. I knew that you and Earl had similar experiences, and that's why I had him on the show today. I want to talk about property management specifically, because I know you both have a lot of knowledge in that arena. But the purpose of these questions today is to help our listeners understand what property management is really like and how involved that is. So, because we have listeners that are like, oh, I want to get into real estate investing, I'm going to do it on my own, but they don't fully understand what that means. So that's what we want to talk about a little bit.
Before we go, I'll just share this so you can probably relate to this. I have joked a number of times. I believe that we're on this earth because we need to grow and progress, right? And I always joke that there's no better relationship on the planet to make you grow and develop than having you live with somebody of the opposite sex. That marriage relationship is there to fulfill our need to be tried and tested. Second only to that is a partnership relationship, right? You go in, you become good friends, you do a lot of things together. I think my two partners and I, we probably spend more time together with each other than we actually do with our wives sometimes. So, and it could be just like a marriage, right? It's incredibly fulfilling, but you have to make sure that you get the right one. Let's put it that way.
Right now, Mike Woodfield is the co-owner. He's the COO and I'm the CEO, but we're 50-50 partners. He just steps up and steps in when I'm out, and I step up and step in when he's out. You know, he just had a baby. But what a perfect partnership that we have developed over the years. They're out there. You find the good ones and you just stick with them because you can make a lot of money. You get a lot of good things. But Ben and Earl, about property management, I have maybe somewhat of a conflicting opinion on property management. My personal preference, I'll start with that. It's just Glenn's personal preference. If I'm going to use a third-party property management company, I'll get a small to medium-sized property management company. Somebody that has, call it, depends on where in the property, 2,000 to 10,000 units, maybe 15. That's a kind of a small to medium-sized company. There are other management companies that have 100 to 300,000 units in their portfolio. And I'm going to share with you maybe two scenarios. I use a small to mid-sized management company on some property we own in Kentucky, a couple, 250 units, something like that. And when I call, I get the owner of the management company. And generally speaking, she's with the regional manager all the time. And I'll say, hey, can you get some new handrails? When I was there last, they're starting to fall off. And she's like, yes, I'll take care of it and send you the bids. And they usually show up within about 2 days. Up in Fort Worth, I was using a mid-sized management company. They got sold to a very large management company that's nationwide. And so the property that I had, management company that I originally hired had about 15,000 units. The ones that manage it now through that acquisition, they probably are 150 to 200,000. So same scenario. I call the regional or the manager, can I get a bid? Yeah, it takes 2 weeks. I call again. I'm like, did you get those bids? Oh, I forgot. I'm like, well, what happened? Well, I have 8, 9, 10 other properties in my portfolio. I had an owner in town. And I said, okay, when are you going to give me those bids? And then when I do come in, they are so high. And being in the business, I'm like, why are these so high? And the response is, well, they're our approved vendor. We only have 2 that we can use. We vetted them out. They've got the proper insurance. They've been in business so long. They pay their fee to be our preferred vendor, and we're going to recommend them. One of those vendors was that plumbing, that water heater that I just shared with you a little while ago, right? It was their preferred vendor. They wanted to charge $6,000 for a hot water heater that serviced 4 machines. But if you have a Class A property that's 500 or 600 units, and you may want to go with a big national company, that brings in corporate tenants, and there's a place for everything, really. But that's where I'm conflicted, right? Because I worked for big management companies. I worked for Equity Residential, super efficient. But they were a REIT, and we had 250,000 apartments, but they were really good at what they did, and we managed our own. We didn't really do fee management for other people. It was a big REIT. And I learned a lot from that company. I also worked for small, like Earl, where I worked for Dale Longhurst. He had 2,000 units in his fee management company. And I personally have owned 6,000 and did my own property management in-house. So I've been all over the world on property management. I have different opinions, depends on the scenario, depends on the owner, depends on the investor. Some people are more hands-on and that's all they do. Some are, maybe they're a roofing contractor and they don't want to be property manager. They just want to invest in real estate. So my advice depends on who's asking the question. Is that elusive enough?
Interesting. You talked about big property management companies. I worked for a very large, it was a publicly traded REIT also. They were headquartered in Addison. You probably know who they are, but it used to be Walden. I think they've changed their name to something else now, but they had over 80,000 apartment units. And I don't know if it was because it was a REIT. I am very outspoken about REITs and how they manage. An example was at the end of the year, we all put our budgets in, right? And they looked at them and they said, if everybody spent this much money and collected this much rent, our share price is going to lose $2 a share this year. We can't have that. So what they do, somebody that had no common sense about property management went through and said, you don't get 20 carpets this month, you only get 12, right? And they dictated that and they sent it back to us. And Walden ended up being sold. Literally, somebody came in and bought out, they paid about half of the full value of those properties, partly because they were on their books, what their acquisition, less depreciation. And that's how they were on their books. So they were less by a long ways. And they weren't focused on raising the value of the property. They were only focused on increasing the income. And usually that meant cutting back the expenses to the point where they weren't run very well. Anyway, the worst management company that I ever worked for was that publicly traded REIT. And it was just exactly that. They were fairly large. And I think some of it was the size and the complexity of getting stuff through a vice president and a regional vice president and a senior vice president and all this kind of stuff, or whatever it happened to be, right? But part of it was because it was a REIT. And you've had that experience. I'm curious what you think about, not necessarily working for, but the way a REIT runs a property versus a developer or that type of thing.
You know, when I was with the REIT, you're absolutely right. I mean, the numbers came from the top down, not necessarily what the assets needed up. And so they're managing towards a return to the shareholders because it's a publicly traded company. And that's what's driving their decisions. A developer or an owner that's going to own it for 10, 15, 20 years, he's going to look and see exactly what the property needs all the time. Although the REIT did that too. The REIT that I worked for at Equity Residential, they were a really good company. They put money in the deal. They did try and do, like you said, Earl, hey, we'll give you 10 carpets this month and maybe you can get 8 more that month or whatever. And then they would lay it out because it's all about cash flow. But you can't predict when you're going to need a carpet. But it just rolls up. It's all numbers. But I learned quite a bit, actually, from the REIT. And I've worked for large management companies and small ones. So yeah, good experience though in the property management. And really the answers really will be, it depends.
I'm curious also, I'm listening to you talk about your experience. It seems like you went from Salt Lake and then I'm assuming Seattle because you were with Equity Residential up in
That's
Seattle.
Right. Yep.
And then what took you to, you're in Austin now. I've spent a little bit of time in Dallas and several times to Austin. I love both of those cities. I'm curious what got you to Austin.
So I was getting laid off my job up in Washington. I actually switched from Equity Residential. I was working for a privately held company and they owned a competing company. I guess it was publicly traded. And I worked for the private side on the value add. And I was an asset manager for them. So I went from being a regional manager, director type of having thousands of units to the ownership side. So now I work for the company at the bottom. I was the asset management. I hired management companies to work for us. So all I did was switched. I still had W-2. I just switched which side of the table I sat on. I went from being the regional manager answering the questions to the asset manager asking the questions to the property management company. And that was a great experience too. But then in 2008 and 2009, they were laying off tons of apartments, employees, me included. And the company went from, 60 employees down to like 15. And that was up in Washington. Same time Washington Mutual went out of business. It was a tough time for everybody. And so I moved to Texas because I had a person that I knew that was buying apartment complexes and he wanted to self-manage. He got tired of the property management company. And so he had a couple thousand units and said, why don't you come down here? I'll make you a partner. And that's what got me from Washington down to Austin. And I did that for a little while until I just finally learned how to syndicate my own deals.
Tell us a little bit about that process. I know you did a couple of deals here and there. How big of a difference is it now? The idea of syndicating, raising money, and how much more complicated this makes your real estate?
Yeah. So really, when you're a W-2 operator, you see things from the property's perspective all the time because that's all I knew. And it gets really different when you're trying to buy a deal and you're negotiating the purchase price and you've got to really understand the type of financing and the amortization that you're going to need to make that deal profitable or not profitable. You factor in whether or not you're going to do a cost segregation on these deals and the investors are going to get a negative K1 in year 1, 2, or 3 or positive K1 because that will determine the type of investors that are coming in. And then you really understand insurance and the premiums and the type of deductibles and the type of coverage you either have or don't have. So your perspective from an owner versus your perspective as an operator are two different worlds. And I had a pretty steep learning curve moving from an operator to the ownership side. And it just, even my legal documents with the attorneys on getting the language correct for the partnership agreement, and then being regulated and making sure that the private placement memorandum is in order with all of the SEC regulations and so forth. So there's just a lot to learn on the ownership side as a sponsor and as a syndicator. But I'll tell you, if you're making money for your investors, they're paying you pretty well. So there's that side of it. So we had probably 3/4 of our portfolio we'd written in some waterfall structures. So the more the investor made, the more, my percentage ownership goes up and my cut gets bigger. So if they're making 20%, 25%, I'm getting a good chunk of the profits as well. So I was highly motivated to make them money, and they liked that structure. And so I don't know, there's a lot we could talk about just on that alone. So
I'm going to ask a couple quick questions about property management. But what do you think an investor, if you're looking to hire a property management company, what do you think that as an owner, what questions should you be asking?
That's a great question, Earl. I would ask what size company they have, number of units, their staff. I would find out what kind of software they're using. Tricky one is I would ask if the regional manager that's going to be over your property, are they centrally located to the other properties in that regional's portfolio? And how many are in her or his portfolio? And the reason I would ask those questions is because if you have a regional manager and you want them to go visit your property, they can go there once a week, once a month, once a quarter, or once a year. And that will dictate on how busy that regional manager is and their capability of getting there, right? So if I have a regional manager and part of their properties are in Dallas and some are in, Waco and some are down in San Antonio, what is the likelihood of that regional actually getting there?
Yeah.
Slim to none. They can't travel frequently enough to really be an effective property manager. On the flip side, if there's a regional that has 7 or 8 properties and they're all within Fort Worth, they have perfected their craft in Fort Worth. They know every vendor, they know the judge on the evictions, they know everything. And those are the good questions that they can ask, is tell me about the regional and things of that nature. So
interesting. I've shared this a few times, I think, but when I was managing the commercial division, all commercial properties, I had probably 120,000 square feet of TIs under management. I used to get in the office at 7 a.m. I'd push the button on my phone that says, "Oh, you got messages," right? And I'd start downloading. And I had 6 or 7 to-do list items from the day before that I had not gotten to yet. And they were rated 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I started taking notes, and I'd get about halfway through the 15 messages from the night before. And I'd go, "Oh my gosh, this is an emergency. I got to go take care of this one right now." Hang up the phone, go make one phone call, which was 2 or 3 more phone calls, right? Then I'd come back and I'd push the button again. And now I'm at 15 or 16 again, and I'm starting one by one. And sometimes it was 4 or 5 o'clock, and I'm looking at my assistant going, "Hey, can you do me a favor? Go down to Subway and get me a sandwich because I'm starving and I'm not going to be out of here." And people don't realize that that's how incredibly busy sometimes you get when you're doing property management.
Yeah. Property management is, because I was in it for so many years, you literally are just putting out fires every single day. Whether it's an employee issue, they quit, got to replace somebody, they got hurt, workman's comp, there's claim on insurance, delinquency, collections, just you name it. Every day there's a fire to be put out somewhere. And I feel, after being in it, and I have a lot of respect for property managers and regionals who are good at what they do, because they've got so many balls up in the air at any one given time. And so if I don't get a call back from a regional today or tomorrow, I cut them a lot of slack.
I was in a class, long story, but I ended up being, I had an anger management class. Has to do with a 20-year-old divorce kind of a thing. And I'm trying to convince the guy, "Hey, I really should not be here. I do not have a massive anger problem." And one of the things that I used as I'm talking to him is I have been a crisis manager my entire career, right? There is nothing. My wife can come in and scream and yell at me at the top of her lungs. And I'm just like, Not going to do any good to fight back. Let her calm down, because I know in a couple hours or at least a day or two, she's going to come back and say she's sorry. We're all going to be happy again. But it's amazing when you go through I think we should have PST or whatever it is, the trauma. If you've been in property management long enough, you need counseling for trauma care, I think.
Without a doubt.
Anyway, last thing about this, tell me a little bit about owners. And we have owners that always joke they got their financial reports every month. They put them in a binder. They gave them to their CPA once a year. And that was all that they did with them. And then I had other owners that, they were calling me every week going, hey, Klein, what about this? And what about this? I literally learned to read financials from a mortgage guy that also owned about 500 units we managed for him. And he literally put me through the ringer every single month until I finally had every single question in advance before he called me, and he knew, and I knew what he was going to ask. And after a couple of times of me having all the answers, he got bored with that. And then he showed up at the property one day, and he calls me from the property and going, hey, what's up with this tree? And what's up with this? And I'm like, oh my gosh, now I got to go walk the properties before I send him the financials too. How often should an owner, how involved should they get to get good service from your property management?
I think you get what you expect. If you want to get on calls and go over the financials, I think the regionals and the department will be, and the property manager, they'll be willing to do that. And I would recommend that. I put together asset management plans when we buy a deal, and I give it to the property manager and the regional. I actually make them sign it. Here's our marching orders. So when we get on a call every week for the first 2 months that we take over or buy an apartment community, that's frequent. Right. But there's a lot of moving parts when you take over a new community, especially if you're doing renovations. Then it gets to once a month where we're going over our financials, and we go over the financials with the property manager and the regional. And then sometimes it goes over longer or shorter. But for the most part, those managers and that regional, they begin to understand the financials themselves, because now they're looking at their own property from an owner's perspective. So if your owners aren't really taking the time to do that, you're really doing a disservice to yourself and to the apartment manager, property manager, and the regional, because they will rise to the occasion. So I read the financials all the time. I even go in with our investors. So I don't know if that answered your question, Earl, or not, but yeah, spend the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I personally believe this. The more involved you are with your management company, the less likely they are that $3,000 water heat. Yours was $6,000, by the way, right? And you wondered how much of that's going back to his brother-in-law, the plumber, or whatever, you know what I mean? But the more often you get involved with those financials, the less likely they are to, quote, steal from you.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And you just got to be hands-on. So Ben, go ahead. You were going to, I interrupted you. I could see.
It's okay. Do you have 5 more minutes? I know we said 60 minutes, but you have 5 more minutes?
I got all day to talk about this stuff. I love this stuff. I ain't going anywhere.
Earl can talk for hours too, so maybe I'll have to rein us in. We've loved everything you've been sharing with us today, Glenn. I want to just briefly touch on Obsidian Capital. Can you give us a little detail about what it is you guys focus on and why somebody might come to talk to you about investing with you?
Yeah, sure. I guess we'll talk about our most recent one. We just bought 232 units. We got that opportunity because close with some of the brokers, and they had a for sale on the partnership side, had to get rid of it. But it was just north of Austin in Temple, and it had an assumable loan of 3.27% interest rate, and it was fixed for the next 10 years, 9.5 years, to be honest. And so it has instant cash flow. They had done some improvements and stuff on the interiors, and we bought it because they hadn't even touched the outside yet. It still looked ugly, but they did a lot of the heavy lifting on the inside. So they really weren't capitalizing or getting the most rents they could. And now that we've owned it for a month and a half, every person moves out, the new one moving in is like $300 more. So we're doing fairly well on the lift in today's environment. That's pretty good. So Obsidian Capital is owned by Mike and I. We're very involved. We walk the units. We do our due diligence. We talk to all the investors. We are not doing a high amount of volume. We don't do deals just to do deals. We make sure that it really is kind of, our deals are customized to our investors. If they want to park their money and don't want to worry about it for 5 or 10 years, we will take them that deal. There are other investors that I only like to tie up my money for 3 to 5 years. I don't want to be long term. So we could find some potential value adds We're actually building some stuff right now from the ground up. And there's a group of investors that like newer product. So they're heavily involved in that. So we try and customize the deals and match up the investors to their personal goals, because everybody's got different goals. Some of them like riskier deals. Some of them don't want to think about it. They're going to put money in just cash flow. Just send me a check once a quarter. And I don't want to pull it out and go find another deal that may or may not make as much money as the last deal. So then they all have different criteria. And we try and we talk to all the investors on the phone. We talk to all of them.
Well, it sounds like you've got a ton of experience, and you're demonstrating that by saying you have different investing strategies used for different investors, and you try to achieve the goals that they're looking for with different investment opportunities, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And they could find us we have our track record and information and links to podcasts like this on our website, which is obsidiancapitalco.com. So Obsidian Capital Co. I think you have links and stuff.
We'll have that in our show notes. Yeah. Glenn, I want to ask you, since you have so much experience in the market, what do you think will happen in the real estate market in the next 5 years? Obviously, this is a very broad question, but you can answer it however you want.
Okay. I do have a crystal ball. Where did I put that thing? Yeah, here it is. And so, the interest rates are going to come back down to a reasonable level. I mean, we could not stay in business if interest rates were really at 2 and 3%, right? Banks can't stay in business. They don't make enough money. The cost of money and all that is just too low. So that stimulated our economy, and it did a great job, right? And people started spending, and then we got inflation. Now we've gone to the other extreme. I believe in the next 5 years that interest rates kind of come down a little bit to kind of the happy medium. And I think that is the right place that we'll need to be. So if you could, in today's environment, find deals that you can underwrite to, then you pull the trigger. There's still a little bit of a disconnect where some sellers are still holding on to a 4.5 cap rate, and interest rates are 7.5%, and that math doesn't add up. You can't buy something at a 4 cap and go get a new loan at 7 and think you're going to make money, because you can't.
We joke about that all the time, right? We just tattoo stupid on their forehead. If your cap rate's going to be higher than or you're lower than your interest rate.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you think you're going to buy it at a 4 cap or a 4.5 cap and improve operations and then sell it at a 3 cap. So those that are really underwriting to compressed cap rates are not going to do well, right? So be conservative in your underwriting. I also believe that when we're underwriting, I used to underwrite to a 5 or 6% rent growth. We are now at a 2% rent growth in our underwriting models. So, and in some cases, maybe flat. Austin has seen double-digit rent growth. Double up in Dallas was very high as well, but we're very conservative. And the reason we're doing that is we do believe that there will be some people being laid off work. People will be affected by the higher interest rates. People will get nervous about spending, so they probably won't upgrade their apartment. They may stay in a classic unit a little longer. So there's so many variables that influence me personally. Plus, I lived through one of those markets where I personally lost a lot of money when the cycle came to an end, and I lost all my money. To be honest with you, I was broke. So I learned a lot. It hurts when you lose money, and I have vowed not to lose money for our investors. So I'd rather not win a deal and be more conservative today. And I would recommend that your investors kind of do the same thing. Your listeners is to really, if you get an offering where you see 10, 12% rent growth and you're going in at a 4 cap, I would just say, ask a lot of questions.
That's a great point. So whether you're investing with Obsidian Capital or any other group for that matter, make sure you're looking at the details of the financials. There's a lot of assumptions that are in there, right? And anybody can make them look however they want to, but being conservative in nature and making sure that the assumptions are making sense for the current market and what we think the market will be like in the future is very important in being able to actually hit those returns. Yeah. So you're at least not losing money and hopefully making a good profit on your investment.
It's very easy for a person in my position or a sponsor to have an exit cap rate at 5, but that really maybe only gets the IRR to a marginal IRR. So they could just change that one number and say, we're just going to exit at a 4.75% on the cap rate. And all of a sudden the profits just jumped. And all they did was change one number in the spreadsheet, and then that moved that IRR up just enough to get somebody's attention. And so be cautious of that too. So,
Thank you for sharing that, Glenn.
yeah.
We could talk to you for hours. Most of our episodes are only about an hour, so we probably have to wrap things up. Is there anything else that you would like to have our listeners know about either property management or just real estate investing in general that you feel is a nugget that would be helpful?
Real estate investing and being in property management has blessed my life and my family. So it's all I know. So I'm very biased, right? I mean, but I've also seen investors make a lot of money as well. So, to your listeners, I guess the nugget would be just be realistic in your expectations. There's no such thing as get rich quick. You see a lot of flash on Instagram and Facebook and some of those other social media platforms. It is a lot of work day in and day out. It's a grind. And so my nugget is just be realistic.
That's very important. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Earl, do you want to do the final four? Or do you want me to do the final four?
Yeah, let me go ahead and we always ask 4 questions of all of our guests. It's interesting to kind of summarize and get a unique perspective. And so some of these I can guess, but we'll ask them anyway. The first one is, what's your favorite business book? And I know you're going to say it's Maintenance Man to Millionaire, I think it is. But
yeah.
No, go ahead.
There's 10 great commandments that are really good things that can help people stay on the right course and make good business decisions if you follow those. I was given a book that I read recently, Never Split the Difference. And I forgot the name of the author, but it's a good book. It really talks about negotiations. And it's very helpful insight, right? You never split the difference. And it just talks about how you can get to the right spot through negotiations where other people don't have to feel like one person won, one person failed. And it's a good read. Yeah.
Very cool.
Chris Voss, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Yeah, that's right.
What do you think brings you happiness?
Oh, there's so many things. I wish you guys could see it. I got my family portrait up there on the wall over there. And, right now I have, 6 grandkids, and my wife and I love spending time together. I don't know. I'm a family guy. At the end of the day, that's what brings me, more happiness than anything else. And it's funny you say that. My daughter is calling me as we speak. So I'll text her back. Family. I go and I do real estate. I'm all in. I perfect my craft to be the very best I can. But in the end, I take all the spoils that I can and share it with me and my family, and we spend time together. So
you might relate to this. I joke all the time. If I'd have found out how much fun grandkids were, I'd have skipped over the kids and gone straight to grandkids. So
yeah, they love you. They just want to play. And I can just give them candy and leave. It's the best.
Mountain Dew and send them home to mom and dad.
Yeah.
Anyway, tell me what your future retirement looks like.
Oh, future retirement. My wife jokes that I will never retire because I love what I do. I come to work and I really enjoy it. I like the people I work with. If I could, I would probably come into work 2 days a week, and then I would travel. I would go visit the kids, the grandkids. I would go see cool places. My wife and I recently went to Israel, and we went to the Holy Land and over to Egypt and had a wonderful time. And that was on her bucket list, and that it was great to be in a position to do that and to go for, 2 weeks there. So I think my retirement, if I could build my cash flow up, and I'm well underway, I've got enough cash flow through just one here, one there, just a little bit of investing that it's replaced my salary. So that's just on cash flow. So that's fun.
Very cool. What do you think the best way to give back?
Oh, if you could be a mentor or share with somebody along the way, and I don't want to get emotional, but there were a couple guys in my career that took me under their wing, and I'll forever be grateful for them because they showed me the ins and outs outside of school or formal education on really what it takes to be a business person. And I today find that so valuable. So I do as much as I can to mentor people and help and answer questions. I don't charge for that. There are people that will mentor for a fee, and I mentor because I've been mentored before. So I give back to the industry as much as and as often as I can.
Thanks very much. We appreciate sharing. And this has been so much fun. It's good to catch up. I didn't realize that I was going to meet an old acquaintance from way, way back in the past, a long, long time ago. today, but I really appreciate the time we spent. Roger and I are thinking about going down visiting a friend of mine down in Houston. We're going to ride motorcycles out to the Twisted Sisters, which is just a little bit west of Austin.
I've been on that road when I had a Goldwing. So yeah, we should stay online and visit for just a sec after you're done recording. But Ben and Earl, this has been so much fun, and you've allowed me to ramble on and share experiences and stories, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. And thank you for allowing me to be a guest on your show.
Absolutely. Let's just finish and then we can keep chatting. On today's episode, we covered getting started in real estate investing. Glenn and Earl shared quite a bit of knowledge about what it's like managing investment property. And Glenn also shared with us what Obsidian Capital does and how you might be able to work with them with investing. Earl, will you finish?
Again, thanks very much. Thanks for joining us on the Retire Wealthy and Happy podcast, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks.
Thanks, Glenn.
Hope you got value from this episode. And if you have a minute, then take the time to leave an honest written review for the podcast, because we take those reviews seriously and it'll help us serve you better on the next episodes. And most importantly, be sure to start taking action so you can control your financial future today.